When it comes to warfare, the side with the most advanced technology is usually the winner. But sometimes, bigger and flashier isn't necessarily better. Superiority by Arthur C. Clarke. Read by Karl. In making this statement, which I do of my own free will, I wish to make it perfectly clear that I am not in any way trying to gain sympathy, nor do I expect any mitigation of whatever sentence the court may pronounce. I write this in an attempt to refute some of the lying reports broadcast over the prison radio and published in the papers I have been allowed to see. These have given an entirely false picture of the true causes of our defeat. As a leader of my race's armed forces and the cessation of hostilities, I feel it my duty to protest against such libels on those who served under me. I also hope this statement may explain the reasons for the application I have twice made to the court. I will now introduce it to grant a favor, for which I can see no possible grounds for refusal. The ultimate cause of our failure was a simple one. Despite all statements to the contrary, it was not due to lack of bravery on the part of our men, nor to any fault of the fleets. We were defeated by one thing only, by the inferior science of our enemies. I repeat, by the inferior science of our enemies. When the war opened, we had no doubt of our ultimate victory. The combined fleets of our allies greatly exceeded in number and armament those which the enemy could muster against us. In almost all branches of military science, we were their superiors. We surely could maintain this superiority. Our belief proved, alas, to be only too well founded. At the opening of the war, our main weapons were the long-range homing torpedo, dirigible ball lightning, and the various modifications of the Clydon beam. Every unit of the fleet was equipped with these. Though they only possessed similar weapons, their installations were generally of lesser power. Moreover, we had behind us a far greater military research organization, and with this initial advantage we could not possibly lose. The campaign proceeded according to plan until the Battle of the Five Suns. We won this, of course, but the opposition proved stronger than we had expected. It was realized that victory might be more difficult and more delayed than had first been imagined. A conference of supreme commanders was therefore called to discuss our future strategy. Present for the first time at one of our war conferences was Professor General Norden, the new chief of the research staff, who had just been appointed to fill the gap left by the death of Malvar, our greatest scientist. Malvar's leadership had been responsible, more than any other single factor, for the efficiency and power of our weapons. His loss was a very serious blow, but no one doubted the brilliance of his successor, though many of us disputed the wisdom of allowing a theoretical scientist to fill a post of such vital importance, but we had been overruled. I can well remember the impression Norden made at the conference. The military advisors were worried, and as usual turned to scientists for help. Was it possible to improve our existing weapons, they asked, so our present advantage could be increased still further? Norden's reply was quite unexpected. Malvar had often been asked such a question, and he had always done what was requested. Frankly, gentlemen, said Norden, I doubt it. Our existing weapons have practically reached finality. I don't wish to criticize my predecessor or the excellent work done by the research staff on the last few generations. Do you realize there has been no basic change in armaments for over a century? It is, I am afraid, the result of a tradition that has become conservative. For too long, the research staff has devoted itself to perfecting odd weapons instead of developing new ones. It's fortunate for us that our opponents have been no wiser. We can't assume this will always be so. Norden's words left an uncomfortable impression, as he had no doubt intended. He quickly pressed home the attack. What we want are new weapons. Weapons totally different from any that have been employed before. Such weapons can be made. It will take time, of course. But since assuming charge, I'll replace some of the older scientists with young ones, and have developed research into several unexplored fields which show great promise. I believe, in fact, that a revolution in warfare may soon be upon us. We were skeptical. There was a bombastic tone in Norden's voice that made us suspicious of his claims. We did not know then he never promised anything he had not already perfected in the laboratory. In the laboratory. That was the operative phrase. Norden proved his case less than a month later, when he demonstrated the sphere of annihilation, which produced complete disintegration of matter over a radius of several hundred meters. We were intoxicated by the power of the new weapon, and were quite prepared to overlook one fundamental defect. The fact that it was a sphere, and hence destroyed its rather complicated generating equipment at the instant of formation. This meant, of course, it could not be used on warships, but only on guided missiles. With a great problem, we started to convert all homing torpedoes to carry the new weapon. For the time being, all further offensives were suspended. We realize now this was our first mistake. I still think it was a natural one, for it seemed to me that all our existing weapons had become obsolete overnight. We already regarded them as almost primitive survivals. What we did not appreciate was the magnitude of the task we were attempting, and the length of time it would take to get these revolutionary superweapon into battle. Nothing like this had happened for 100 years. We had no previous experience to guide us. The conversion problem proved far more difficult than anticipated. A new class of torpedo had to be designed because the standard model was too small. This meant in turn that only the larger ships can launch the weapon, and we were prepared to accept this penalty. After 6 months, the heavy units of the fleet were being equipped with the sphere. Training maneuvers and tests determined it was operating satisfactorily and were ready to take it into action. Norden was already being hailed as the architect of victory, and it had promised even more spectacular weapons. Then two things happened. One of our battleships disappeared completely on its training flight. An investigation showed that under certain conditions, the ship's long-range radar could trigger the sphere immediately it had been launched. The modification needed to overcome this defect was trivial, but it caused a delay of another month, and was a source of much bad feeling between the naval staff and the scientists. We were ready for action again, when Norden announced that the radius of effectiveness of the sphere had been increased by 10, thus multiplying by 1,000 times the chances of destroying an enemy ship. So the modification started all over again. Everyone agreed the delay would be worth it. Meanwhile, however, the enemy had been boiled by the absence of further attacks, and it made an unexpected onslaught. Our ships were short of torpedoes, since none had been coming from the factories, and were forced to retire. So we lost the systems of Kyrene and Floranus, and the planetary fortress of Ramsandan. It was annoying, but not a serious blow, for the recaptured systems had been unfriendly and difficult to administer. We had not doubt we could restore the position in the near future as soon as the new weapon became operational. These hopes were only partially fulfilled. When we renewed our offensive, had to do so with fewer of the spears of annihilation than had been planned, and that was one reason for our limited success. The other reason was more serious. While we were equipping as many of our ships as we could with the irresistible weapon, the enemy had been building feverishly. His ships were of the old pattern, with the old weapons, but they now outnumbered ours. When we went into action, we found the numbers ranged against us were over 100% greater than expected, causing target confusion among the automatic weapons and resulting in higher losses than anticipated. The enemy losses were higher still, for once the sphere had reached its objective, destruction was certain, but the balance had not swung as far in our favor as we had hoped. Moreover, while the main fleets had been engaged, the enemy had launched a daring attack on the lightly held systems of Iristron, Duranus, Carmonindo, and Faradon, recapturing them all. We thus faced with a threat only 50 light years from our home planets. It was much for culmination in the next meeting of the Supreme Commanders. Most of the complaints were addressed to Norden, Grand Admiral Taxorus in particular maintaining that thanks to our admittedly irresistible weapon, we were now considerably worse off than before. We should, he claimed, have continued to build the conventional ships, thus preventing the loss of our numerical superiority. Norden was equally angry and called the naval staff ungrateful bunglers. We could tell he was worried, as indeed we all were, by the unexpected turn of events. He knew there might be a speedy way of remedying this situation. We now know that researchers had been working on the battle analyzer for many years. By the time it came as a revelation to us, and perhaps we were too easily swept off our feet. Norden's argument also was seductively convincing. What did it matter, he said, if the enemy had twice as many ships as we, if the efficiency of ours could be doubled or even trebled? For decades, the limiting factor in warfare had not been mechanical but biological. It become more and more difficult for any single mind or group of minds to cope with the rapidly changing complexities of battle in three-dimensional space. Northern mathematicians had analyzed some of the classic engagements of the past, and has shown that even when being victorious, we had often operated units at much less than half of their theoretical efficiency. The battle analyzer would change all this by replacing operations staff with electronic calculators. The idea was not new, in theory, but not until now it had been no more than a utopian dream. Many of us find it difficult to believe it was still anything but a dream. After we had run through several very complex dummy battles, however, we were convinced. We decided to install the analyzer in 4 of our heaviest ships. Each of the main fleets could be equipped with one. At this stage, the trouble began, though we did not know it until later. The analyzer contained just short of 1 million vacuum tubes and needed a team of 500 technicians to maintain and operate it. It was quite impossible to accommodate the extra staff aboard a battleship, each of the 4 units had to be accompanied by a converted liner to carry the technicians not on duty. Installation was also a very slow and tedious business, but by gigantic efforts it was completed in 6 months. Then, to our dismay, we were confronted by another crisis. Nearly 5,000 highly skilled men had been selected to serve the analyzers and had been given an intensive course at the technical training schools. At the end of 7 months, 10% of them had nervous breakdowns and only 40% had qualified. Once again, everyone started to blame everyone else. Morden, of course, said that the research staff could not be held responsible, and so would claim the enmity of the personnel and training commands. It was finally decided the only thing to do was to use 2 instead of 4 analyzers, and bring the others into action as soon as men could be trained. There was little time to lose, for the enemy was still on the offensive and his morale was rising. The first analyzer fleet was ordered to recapture the system of Ariston. On the way, by one of the hazards of war, the liner carrying Tenacious was struck by a roving mine. A warship would have survived, but the liner with its irrepressible cargo was totally destroyed, so the operation had to be abandoned. The Earth expedition was, at first, more successful. It was no doubt at all that the analyzer fulfilled its design claims, and the enemy was heavily defeated in the first engagements. He withdrew, leaving his possession of Saffron, Lucon, and Hexorex, but his intelligence staff must have noticed the change in our tactics and the inexorable presence of a liner in the heart of our battle fleet. Must have noted also that our first fleet had been accompanied by a similar ship, and had withdrawn when it had been destroyed. In the next engagement, the enemy used his superior numbers to launch an overwhelming attack on the analyzer ship and its unarmed consort. The attack was made without regard to losses. Both ships were, of course, very heavily protected, and it succeeded. The result was a virtual decapitation of the fleet. Such an effectual transfer to the old operational methods proved impossible. We disengaged under heavy fire, so lost all our gains and also systems of Lormia, Ismarznus, Burinus, Alphenodon, and Sidenius. At this stage, Grand Admiral Taraxis expressed his disappointment of Norden by committing suicide, and I assumed supreme command. The situation was by now both serious and infuriating. With stubborn conservatism and complete lack of imagination, the enemy continued to advance with its old-fashioned, inefficient, but now vastly more numerous ships. It was going to realize that if we had only continued building, without seeking new weapons, we would have been in a far more advantageous position. There were many acrimonious conferences in which Norden defended the scientists, while everyone else blamed him for all that had happened. The difficulty was that Norden had proved every one of his claims. He had a perfect excuse for all disasters that had occurred, and we could not now turn back. The search for an irresistible weapon must go on. At first, it had been a luxury to shorten the war. Now it was a necessity if we were to end it victoriously. We were on the defensive, and so was Norden. He was more than ever determined to re-establish his prestige and that as a research staff. But we had been twice disappointed and would not make the same mistake again. No doubt Norden's 20,000 scientists would produce many further weapons. We would remain unimpressed. We were wrong. The final weapon was something so fantastic that even now it seems impossible to believe it ever existed. Its innocent, non-committal main, the exponential field, gave no hint of its real possibilities. Some of Norseman's physicists discovered it doing a piece of entirely theoretical research into the properties of space. To everyone's great surprise, the results were found to be physically realizable. It seems very difficult to explain the operation of the field to the layman. According to the technical description, it produces an exponential condition of space, and a finite distance in normal linear space may become infinite in pseudospace. Norden gave an analogy that some of us found useful. As if one took a flat disk of rubber, representing a region of normal space, and pulled its center out to infinity. The circumference of the disk will be unaltered, but its diameter will be infinite. This is the sort of thing that has generated the field due to the space around it. As an example, suppose a ship containing a generator was surrounded by a ring of hostile machines. If it switched on the field, each of the enemy ships with it and the ships on the far side of the circle had suddenly receded into nothingness. Yet the circumference of the circle will be the same as before. Only its very center will be of infinite duration, for as one proceeded, distances would appear to become greater and greater as the scale of space altered. It was a nightmare condition, but a very useful one. Nothing can reach a ship carrying the field. It might be globed by an enemy fleet, it would be inaccessible as if it was on the other side of the universe. Against this, of course, they cannot fight back without switching off the field, but this still left it a very good advantage, not only in defense but in offense. For a ship fitted with the field could approach an enemy fleet undetected and suddenly appear in its midst. This time there seemed to be no flaws in the new weapon. Needless to say, we looked for all the possible rejections before we committed ourselves again. Fortunately, the equipment was fairly simple and did not require a large operating staff. After much debate, we decided to rush into production, realized that time was running short and the war was going against it. We had now lost about the whole of our initial gains, and enemy forces had made several raids into our own solar system. We managed to hold off the enemy while the fleet was re-equipped and the new battle techniques were worked out. To use the field operationally, it was necessary to locate an enemy formation, set a course to intercept it, and then switch on a generator for the calculated period of time. On releasing the field again, if the calculations had been accurate, one would be in the enemy's midst and could do great damage to the resulting confusion, returning by the same route when necessary. The first trial move was pretty satisfactory, and the equipment seemed quite reliable. Numerous mock attacks were made, and the crews became accustomed to the new techniques. I was on one of the test flights, and could vividly remember their impressions as the field was switched on. Ships around us seemed to dwindle as if on the surface of an expanding bubble. In an instant, they had vanished completely. So at the stars, presently we could see the galaxy was still visible as a faint band of light around the ship. The virtual radius of our pseudospace was not really infinite, but some 100,000 light years, and so the distance to the farther stars of our system had not been greatly increased, though the nearest had, of course, totally disappeared. Those training maneuvers, however, had to be cancelled before they were complete, owing to a whole flock of minor technical problems in various pieces of equipment, notably the communication circuits. These were annoying, but not important, though it was thought best to return to base to clear them up. And at that moment, the enemy made what was obviously intended to be a decisive attack against the fortress planet of Bonn at the limits of our solar system. The fleet had to go into battle before repairs could be made. The enemy must believe we had mastered the secret invisibility, as in a sense we had. Our ships appeared suddenly out of nowhere and inflicted tremendous damage, for a while, and then something quite baffling and inexplicable happened. I was in command of the flagship Hyrcania when the trouble started. We were operating as independent units, each against assigned objectives. Our detectives observed an enemy formation at mid-range, and the navigating officers measured distance with great accuracy. We set course and switched on the generator. The expansional field was wasted the moment we should have been passing through the center of the enemy group. Through our constellation, we emerged into normal space, at a distance of many hundred miles. When we found the enemy, he had already found us. We retreated and tried again. This time we were so far away from the enemy that he located us first. Obviously, something was seriously wrong. We broke communicator silence and tried to contact the other ships of the fleet to see if they experienced the same trouble. Once again, we failed. This time the failure was beyond all reason, for the communication equipment appeared to be working perfectly. We could only assume, fantastic though it seemed, the rest of the fleet had been destroyed. I do not wish to describe the scenes when the scattered units of the fleet struggled back to base. Our casualties had actually been negligible, but the ships were completely demoralized. Almost all had lost touch with one another, and found their radio equipment showed inexplicable errors. It was obvious that the exponential fuel was the cause of the troubles, despite the fact that it only apparent when it was switched off. The explanation came too late to do us any good, and nor did its final discomfiture was small consolation for the virtual loss of the war. As I've explained, the fuel generators produced a radial distortion of space, distances turning greater and greater as one approached the center of the artificial pseudospace. When the field was switched off, conditions returned to normal. But not quite. Never possible to restore the initial state exactly. Switching the field on and off was equivalent to an elongation and contraction of a ship carrying the generator, but there was a hysteretic effect, as it were. The initial condition was never quite reproducible, owing to all the thousands of electrical changes and movements of mass aboard the ship while the field was on. These asymmetries and distortions were cumulative. Though they seldom amounted to more than one fraction of 1%, that was quite enough. It meant that precise range of equipment and the tuned circuits and the communication apparatus were thrown completely out of adjustment. Any single ship can never detect a change, only to compare its equipment with that of another vessel and try to communicate with it, nor could it tell what had happened. It is impossible to describe the resultant chaos. Not a single component of one ship could be expected with certainty to work aboard another. The very nuts and bolts were no longer interchangeable, and supply position became quite impossible. Given time, we might even have overcome these difficulties, but the enemy ships are already attacking in thousands, with weapons which now seem centuries behind those we have invented. Our magnificent fleet, crippled by our own science, fought on as best it could until it was overwhelmed and forced to surrender. The ships fitted with the field were still invulnerable, but as fighting units they were almost helpless. Every time they switched on their generators to escape an enemy attack, the permanent distortion of their equipment increased. In a month it was all over. This is the true story of our defeat, which I give without prejudice to my defense before this court. I make it, as I have said, to counteract the libels that have been circulating against the men who fought under me, and to show where the true blame for our misfortunes lay. Finally, my request, which as the court will now realize I make in no frivolous manner, and which I hope will therefore be granted. The court will be aware that the conditions under which we are housed, and the constant surveillance to which we are subjected day and night, are somewhat distressing. Yet I am not complaining of this, nor do I complain of the fact that shortage of accommodation has made it necessary to house us in pairs. But I cannot be held responsible for my future actions if I am compelled any longer to share my cell with Professor Norden, late Chief of the Research Staff of my Armed Forces. The End.